The Valari Republic had always lived by a simple rule: peace above all else. Their people valued knowledge, diplomacy, and careful planning over conflict. Their cities were marvels of culture and art, not fortresses. On their homeworld, the spires of government rose above lush green forests. Rivers sparkled in sunlight, and the streets were always alive with the hum of commerce and conversation. The Valari were a careful people. They believed that if they acted wisely, no enemy would dare challenge them. Their reputation as scholars and diplomats was well known across their region of space. Many species respected them, and a few even envied their calm, orderly civilization. But that respect had its limits, and the Valari were about to find out just how fragile their peaceful existence was. Life in the Valari Republic was not built on weapons or armies. Unlike many other civilizations in the galaxy, the Valar had no massive fleets or huge warships ready for combat. They had patrol ships, some defense satellites, and trained peacekeepers, but that was all. For generations, they had avoided war through negotiation and alliances. When border disputes arose, the Valari would send their diplomats first, confident that reason and logic could solve nearly any problem. Their history books were full of stories of conflicts that had been ended with treaties, gifts, and careful mediation rather than violence. They believed in the power of words, and that belief had served them well for hundreds of years. However, peace is often a fragile thing. Beyond the Valari's borders lay the Crocs' dominion, a militaristic and aggressive empire that expanded relentlessly. The Crocs did not care about treaties, diplomacy, or culture. To them, other species were obstacles, resources, or trophies. They had conquered dozens of systems, leaving scorched planets and destroyed civilizations in their wake. They saw the Valari not as equals to negotiate with, but as soft and easy targets. At first, the Valari dismissed the threat, believing that their reputation as careful and intelligent negotiators would protect them. But the Crocs were patient predators, and patience, in this case, was deadly. The warning signs were subtle at first. A border outpost went silent for a week, and when scouts were sent, they found it abandoned and burned. Trade ships were intercepted en routes near the outer colonies, their cargo stolen, crews captured. The Valari Council held emergency meetings, but their discussions were calm, almost too calm. They could not yet imagine the scale of the danger. Many of the council members still hoped that a few messages, reminders of treaties, and peaceful negotiations could stop the Crocs. Some even argued against calling for help from other species, saying that the Valari should handle the situation themselves. Pride and tradition made them hesitant, but reality slowly forced their hand. The Valari leaders finally realized that their colonies and their people were in grave danger. Their patrol ships were no match for the Crocs' fast, heavily armed fleets. Even if they tried to evacuate civilians, there weren't enough ships to carry everyone to safety. Panic quietly began to seep into the council chambers, though it was rarely spoken aloud. The younger members of the council, those who had only known peace, were terrified. They saw their world, which had seemed so safe and stable, now teetering on the edge of disaster. They understood that their civilization's way of life could be wiped out in a matter of days. It was then that one of the senior advisors suggested a solution that had been discussed quietly in academic circles, but never seriously considered: contact the humans. The humans were known in rumors and scattered reports across the galaxy. They were called the Deathworlders because of the harshness of the planet they came from, a place full of deadly predators, extreme weather, and poisonous landscapes. The humans had survived, evolved, and thrived in an environment where most species would have perished. Over centuries, stories had spread of their toughness, their creativity in survival, and their unpredictable nature in war. Few civilizations had ever encountered humans directly, but those that did often described them as astonishingly powerful and relentless. To the Valari, humans were almost mythical, and reaching out to them was both a desperate gamble and a bold move. Sending a request for help was a difficult decision. Diplomatically, it was risky. Humans were known for acting on instinct and for interpreting messages literally. A poorly worded plea could result in unintended consequences, but the Valari had no other options. They drafted a carefully constructed message, explaining their situation. The Crocs' dominion was invading their border systems. Their fleets were insufficient, and civilians were in immediate danger. They emphasized that they did not want war, that their request was only for defensive aid and evacuation support. It was written politely, with all the customary deference that the Valari believed humans would respect. But even in its careful phrasing, the message contained a desperate undertone, a quiet cry from a civilization on the brink. Once the message was sent, the Valari waited, and they waited. Days passed, weeks. Each day brought reports of more colonies falling, more civilian ships destroyed or captured, and more border systems swallowed by Crocs' forces. The council met every day, trying to adjust their plans, trying to prepare for every possible contingency. But the more they planned, the more hopeless it seemed. They had asked for help, but help had not yet arrived. And in that void of uncertainty, fear began to spread among the citizens. People whispered about the Crocs, about the humans, about the possibility that no one would come. In the markets, in the schools, in the streets, the mood was tense. Children played quietly. Parents worried openly, and leaders struggled to maintain the calm and orderly society that Valerie prized. Meanwhile, the Croc's dominion continued to advance. They were not patient like the Valari. They did not wait or negotiate. They moved quickly, striking with precision and efficiency. Their warships could crush a colony's defenses in hours. Their propaganda broadcasts mocked the Valari, calling them weak, naive, and foolish. Every attack was broadcast widely, a warning to anyone who might consider resisting the Crocs. The Valari could only watch and hope that the humans had received their message, that the legendary Deathworlders would act in time. But there was no guarantee. The humans had their own ways, their own priorities, and their own interpretation of the situation. The Valari could only wait and prepare for the worst. In the Valari capital, the council worked tirelessly. They coordinated evacuation plans, organized civilian shelters, and tried to strengthen whatever defenses they could muster. Yet they knew that their efforts were limited. Even their most advanced patrol ships could barely challenge the Croc's fleets. Satellite arrays that monitored the borders were constantly under attack, and every failure was a reminder of their vulnerability. The council members understood that if help did not arrive soon, their civilization could be destroyed. Not just their cities or ships, but their culture, their art, their knowledge, and everything they held dear. The weight of this realization pressed heavily on every decision they made. Amid this uncertainty, the council also debated what kind of help they expected. They hoped for a diplomatic envoy or a few armed escorts, something to show the Crocs that they were not alone and to provide minimal protection for evacuation efforts. They never imagined a full-scale intervention. Humans to them were an unknown variable, potentially dangerous themselves. And yet, the more the Crocs advanced, the more the Valari realized that they had reached the limit of what diplomacy could achieve. Words alone would no longer save them. They needed someone capable of decisive action, someone willing to risk everything to prevent their destruction. And in the legends of the humans, they saw a glimmer of hope. Finally, as the first real signs of Croc's bombardment appeared near the outer colonies, the council faced the reality they had long delayed. They had sent the request for help and the message was now beyond their control. The decision had been made, the die was cast, and all they could do now was hope that the humans would respond. The citizens prepared as best they could, boarding transports, reinforcing shelters, and praying that the mysterious Deathworlders would arrive in time. Every hour brought new reports of Croc's ships closing in. The tension in the capital was almost unbearable. Children clung to their parents, council members paced endlessly, and the streets were filled with people moving nervously, unsure what the future would bring. In this time of quiet dread, the Valari also reflected on their history. They had always believed in peace, in negotiation, and in careful planning, but history had not prepared them for the aggression of the Crocs, nor for the possibility that they might survive only because of forces beyond their understanding. They were about to learn, in the most dramatic way imaginable, that the galaxy was far bigger, more dangerous, and far more unpredictable than they had ever imagined. And as they waited, they could not help but feel a mixture of fear and hope, the kind that grips all who face impossible odds. The Valari Republic, at that moment, was on the brink of a turning point. Their civilization, their way of life, and their very existence depended not on diplomacy or strategy, but on the arrival of the humans, the legendary Deathworlders, and they did not know that what was about to arrive would be far beyond anything they had ever imagined. The Valari Republic had sent their request for help, and the waiting began. At first, there was a fragile hope that the humans, the legendary Deathworlders, would respond quickly. Yet, as days turned into weeks, that hope began to feel more like anxiety. Every day, reports came in from the outer colonies, each more alarming than the last. Small border worlds were being overrun by the Croc's dominion, and the methods of the invaders were cruel and systematic. Entire cities disappeared, their populations scattered or enslaved. The Valari citizens, who had always believed in the safety of their civilization, were now forced to confront a terrifying reality. They were completely vulnerable. The systems that had been secure for generations were now on the front line of a war. They had not prepared for that. Valari leadership faced a crisis. Their traditional way of handling threats, careful diplomacy, negotiation, and measured responses was proving useless. The Crocs did not respond to messages, did not respect treaties, and did not hesitate to destroy anything in their path. They were ruthless, experienced in war, and determined to conquer the Council of Elders held continuous meetings, trying to come up with strategies that could delay or mitigate the disaster. However, every plan they made was limited by the resources available. They had some patrol ships, a few defensive satellites, and peacekeeping forces, but that was nothing compared to the Croc's war machines that were now advancing on their borders. The Council sent scouts and intelligence teams to observe Croc's movements, hoping to find a weakness or a delay they could exploit. These scouts reported grim news. The Croc's fleets moved with precision, striking swiftly and disappearing before the Valari could respond. Their attacks were coordinated, showing a level of military strategy that made the Valari leaders realize just how outmatched they were. Each day, new colonies fell, and each time a colony was lost, fear grew among the remaining population. People started whispering about the inevitability of defeat, and even those who had been calm and composed began to worry openly. Panic, though still restrained, was spreading quietly through the cities and spaceports. The Valari had always valued planning and preparation, but now they were forced into reactive measures. Evacuation plans were drafted and redrafted, but the number of ships available was limited. They had hoped to transport civilians to safe nearby systems, but every route was under threat. The outer colonies, which had once been considered secure and distant enough to remain untouched, were now within range of the Croc's assault. Each colony that fell brought a flood of refugees to the core worlds, overwhelming the infrastructure and creating a crisis in the very heart of the Valari Republic. The Council did what they could to maintain order, but resources were stretched thin, and fear was spreading faster than any fleet or ship could contain it. Meanwhile, the Crocs were not only advancing militarily but also psychologically. They broadcasted propaganda messages across Valari communications channels, mocking the Republic for being soft and weak. The messages were designed to demoralize the population, to make people believe that no help would come, and that resistance was futile. Families listened to the broadcasts with growing dread. Children asked questions their parents could not answer, and the public began to realize just how dire the situation had become. The Valari leadership understood that this psychological pressure could be just as dangerous as the physical attacks. People needed hope, yet every day brought new reminders of their vulnerability. As the Croc's attacks continued, the Council realized they could not rely solely on hope or prayers for the humans to arrive. They had to prepare for the worst-case scenario while still holding on to the possibility of rescue. They reinforced defenses wherever possible, though the resources were insufficient for any meaningful protection against the Croc's fleets. Patrol ships were positioned along key routes to delay attacks, and satellite defenses were activated to monitor and intercept enemy movements. Training programs for civilians were accelerated to ensure basic survival skills. Emergency shelters were stocked with supplies, and evacuation routes were mapped in painstaking detail. But no matter how carefully the Council planned, the sense of impending disaster loomed over every decision they made. Amid these preparations, the Valari also tried to understand the humans better. They knew only fragments of the truth about the Deathworlders, gleaned from old reports, myths, and rare encounters. Humans were said to be physically strong, exceptionally resilient, and capable of surviving in conditions that would kill almost any other species. They were also unpredictable, often acting in ways that made sense only to themselves. Some in the Council wondered if the humans would even respond to a polite request, or if they might misinterpret it entirely. Still, the legends of human power gave the Valari a fragile hope. They imagined what it would mean if the humans arrived, a race accustomed to extreme danger, fully capable of combat, and willing to protect those in distress. During this tense period, the Croc's attacks intensified. The outermost colonies reported the arrival of massive Croc's warships, each one capable of destroying entire cities with a single strike. The Valari patrols tried to intercept these ships, but their defenses were outmatched in every engagement. Entire planetary systems were falling before the Council could respond effectively. Messages from these colonies arrived with delays and gaps, sometimes arriving as fragmented distress signals that spoke of horror and destruction. Every new report deepened the sense of urgency and fear. The Valari people, once confident in their leader's wisdom and strategy, began to feel helpless against the relentless advance of the Croc's dominion. Despite the escalating attacks, the Council worked tirelessly to maintain order. They held public addresses, encouraging citizens to follow emergency protocols, reassuring them that plans were in place, and urging patience. Yet the tension was palpable. Citizens lined up at spaceports preparing to evacuate, while others fortified their homes or sought shelter underground. Schools were closed, businesses operated under emergency conditions, and the normally serene capital was alive with nervous energy and constant movement. The Council knew that they needed a miracle, or at least a powerful ally, to prevent total disaster. The Council also debated the type of assistance they might receive from the humans. Would it be military, as in combat ships and soldiers? Would it be logistical, helping evacuate civilians and transport them to safety? Or would it be something entirely different, something beyond the Council's understanding? These debates continued endlessly, reflecting both the uncertainty and desperation of the situation. Every Council member understood that the stakes were higher than ever before. This was no longer just a political problem or a border skirmish. It was a question of survival for an entire civilization. The Republic could survive only if an external force, a strong and capable ally, intervened. While the Council deliberated, the Crocs launched another major offensive. A fleet larger than anything the Valari had encountered before entered the outermost system. The defenses were quickly overwhelmed, forcing the local population to flee in the only remaining ships. Reports from the colony described ships burning in space, cities destroyed, and civilians narrowly escaping capture. The Council received these updates with a mixture of horror and urgency. Each report brought new lessons about the methods and power of the Crocs, as well as a clearer picture of the imminent danger to the core worlds. The Republic's defenses, already stretched thin, were now on the verge of collapse. Amidst the chaos, The council members began to reflect on their long-standing reliance on diplomacy. They realized that their strategies, which had succeeded for centuries in avoiding conflict, were insufficient in the face of an aggressive, relentless enemy like the Croc's dominion. Every measure they took to delay attacks or protect civilians was temporary, barely holding back the tide of destruction. Panic, frustration, and fear began to affect the council itself. Meetings grew longer and more tense, with disagreements about the best course of action. Some members wanted to launch counterattacks, while others argued for immediate evacuation of all colonies. There was no easy answer, and every option carried risks at the same time. Rumors began circulating among the Valari population about the humans. Stories from traders and travelers described the Deathworlders' resilience, their combat skill, and their willingness to act decisively in situations of danger. These tales spread rapidly, giving the people a fragile sense of hope. The council tried to manage expectations carefully, emphasizing that any help from humans might be unpredictable and might not arrive in time. Yet, deep down, everyone in the Republic knew that the humans were their last hope, their potential salvation from the relentless Croc's advance. The stories, mixed with fear and hope, created a charged atmosphere that gripped both leaders and citizens alike. The weeks continued, each day bringing new challenges. Refugees from outer colonies arrived in crowded transport ships, creating logistical crises. Supply lines were strained, emergency shelters were overflowing, and the Republic's resources were being consumed at an alarming rate. The Council had to balance immediate survival needs with strategic decisions about defending the remaining colonies and preparing for the potential arrival of human allies. It was a delicate balancing act, with no clear right answer. Every decision carried consequences, and failure could mean the destruction of the Valari civilization. Finally, as the Croc's fleets approached the inner systems, the Valari could no longer ignore the reality of their situation. They had done all they could to prepare, but the gap between their defenses and the enemy's power was vast. They could only hope that the humans had received their request for help and would respond with the speed and force necessary to prevent disaster. The citizens, while fearful, began to take the first steps towards survival. Families packed belongings, trained in emergency procedures, and made difficult decisions about who would leave and who would stay behind. The streets were alive with nervous activity, reflecting both fear and determination. The Republic's survival depended not on its own strength, but on the intervention of a powerful and unpredictable ally. The Valari learned lessons they had never anticipated. They realized that diplomacy alone could not guarantee safety, that their civilization was vulnerable in ways they had never imagined, and that survival sometimes required relying on forces beyond their control. The Council, the citizens, and even the refugees all faced the same stark reality. Without decisive help, they could be annihilated. Yet, in the midst of fear and uncertainty, there remained a flicker of hope, the belief that the humans, the legendary Deathworlders, might arrive in time, and with them, the chance for survival against overwhelming odds. The crisis that had been building for weeks reached a point where calm no longer existed. The Valari Republic, once a society defined by careful planning, diplomacy, and measured responses, now faced chaos on a scale they had never imagined. The Croc's dominion, a relentless and aggressive force, had advanced deep into Valari space, their warships tearing through outer colonies as if they were mere obstacles in a game of strategy. Each report that reached the capital brought new horrors: cities destroyed, patrol ships obliterated, and thousands of civilians fleeing in terror. The Council had spent weeks preparing, adjusting evacuation plans, reinforcing defenses where possible, and doing their best to keep morale high. But all those efforts now seemed insufficient in the face of the overwhelming threat on the Valari homeworld. The streets were tense with anticipation. Citizens moved nervously, carrying supplies, evacuating families, and preparing for the worst. Markets operated under emergency protocols. Schools were closed indefinitely, and public services were struggling to maintain order. Even the normally serene parks and cultural centers were abandoned as the reality of war set in. Rumors of human assistance still lingered, but they were just whispers. Many people could not believe that a species so unpredictable and distant would intervene in time to save them. Fear was constant, but it was not paralyzing. The Valari had trained for emergency situations, and they acted with precision even under pressure. Every movement, every plan, every step was calculated. Yet the danger felt unstoppable. Meanwhile, the Croc's forces were advancing faster than expected. Their fleet had grown to immense proportions, with each warship capable of leveling an entire city. They moved with terrifying efficiency, striking simultaneously on multiple fronts. Valari patrols were quickly overwhelmed, their few ships no match for the Croc's cruisers and destroyers. Communications from the outer colonies became sporadic, often interrupted by enemy jamming. When messages did arrive, they were fragmented, often describing chaos and destruction, civilians fleeing in panic, and defenders unable to hold their ground. The Croc's broadcasted these messages publicly, using them as psychological weapons to further intimidate the Valari people. "You are weak," the Croc's claimed. "No help will come. You cannot survive." Each broadcast served to heighten tension and fear. reinforcing the sense that the Republic's survival was slipping away. Within the council chambers, urgency and fear mixed with frustration. Leaders argued over strategies, debated the best allocation of limited resources, and faced the terrifying reality that their civilization might not survive. Some council members wanted to consolidate the remaining fleets and make a desperate stand in the inner systems. Others insisted on focusing solely on evacuation, preserving the population at the cost of territory and technology. Each option carried enormous risks, and the council was forced to make decisions with no guarantees of success. The pressure on the leaders was immense. Their ancestors had relied on diplomacy to protect the Republic for centuries, but diplomacy could no longer shield them from the Crox's aggression. That at the same time, hope persisted in the form of the humans. The legendary death, though still distant and mysterious, the stories of human resilience and combat capability gave the council and the population a faint glimmer of hope. They had sent a plea for help weeks ago, describing the scale of the threat, and the council hoped that the humans had understood the urgency. Yet the humans were known to act on their own terms, interpreting messages in ways unique to them. It was impossible to predict when or even if they would arrive. Every council member knew that the arrival of humans could be the difference between survival and total annihilation. But until that moment came, the Republic had to hold together with the resources they had. The outer colonies continued to fall, each loss reinforcing the reality that the Crocs were unstoppable by conventional means. Entire planetary systems disappeared under the Dominion's assault. Civilians fled in desperation, often packing into overcrowded transport ships or trying to hide in underground shelters. The few Valari warships remaining were stretched across multiple fronts, trying to defend cities, escort evacuees, and monitor enemy movements simultaneously. It was a chaotic ballet of survival, where every move carried enormous risk. Communications lines were overloaded with urgent requests for help, status updates, and reports of civilian casualties. The council worked around the clock to respond, but even their best efforts could not match the pace of the Croc's advance during this period. The psychological toll on the population grew heavier. The once proud Valari people, accustomed to safety and stability, now faced the possibility of annihilation. Citizens questioned whether their civilization could endure such violence. Parents worried about the survival of their children, and leaders worried about maintaining order in the face of panic. Rumors spread of other civilizations that had been destroyed by the Crocs, emphasizing the vulnerability of the Valari. Yet even amidst fear, acts of courage emerged. Small groups of citizens took initiative, helping organize evacuations, providing medical aid, and maintaining essential services under dangerous conditions. The Republic's people, while terrified, refused to give in completely to despair. As the Croc's fleets approached the inner systems, the Council faced its most critical decision yet. Evacuation was no longer optional, it was a matter of survival. Transport ships were mobilized to carry civilians to distant, safer systems. Though the routes were perilous, many ships would have to pass through areas already under Croc's control, risking destruction or capture. Evacuation coordination became a monumental task, with leaders prioritizing the movement of women, children, the elderly, and the most vulnerable. While still attempting to preserve as much of the civilian population as possible, the Council understood that mistakes could cost thousands of lives, and every action was weighed with precision at the same time. The Valari military prepared for what they feared might be the last stand. Patrol ships and remaining defense satellites were positioned strategically to slow the Croc's advance, hoping to buy time for evacuation and, perhaps, for the humans to arrive. Training programs for civilians were accelerated, teaching basic survival skills, emergency procedures, and ways to avoid detection from enemy forces. Every citizen, every soldier, and every council member understood the stakes. If the Crocs broke through the defenses, the Republic could be destroyed completely. The tension in the capital was palpable, as the reality of imminent invasion became impossible to ignore. Amid the chaos, the Valari continued to monitor communications for any sign of the humans. Every incoming transmission was scanned for anomalies or hidden messages. Analysts pored over star charts, looking for unusual warp signatures or patterns that might indicate the arrival of an allied fleet. Every day that passed without human intervention increased the pressure, yet no reports came. The Council had to prepare as if no help would arrive, while still daring to hope for a miraculous intervention. This duality, fear and hope, coexisting defined the Republic during these critical days. Then came the first reports of massive Croc's assault fleets entering the inner systems. These were fleets unlike anything the Valari had ever seen, heavily armed, coordinated, and terrifyingly efficient. Entire cities were at risk, and evacuation operations were suddenly in jeopardy. Panic spread among civilians as transport ships were attacked, forcing leaders to make split-second decisions to redirect ships, organize defenses, and maintain order under fire. The Council worked tirelessly, issuing commands, coordinating rescue efforts, and trying to anticipate the Croc's strategy. Every second mattered, and every choice carried life-or-death consequences. At the height of this escalation, the outer colonies had already suffered immense losses. Families were separated, cities destroyed, and supply lines cut. The Valerie leadership could only hope that the remaining colonies could survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The Croc's dominion had demonstrated that they would stop at nothing, and the Republic faced the stark reality that survival depended on a miracle. Rumors of human intervention persisted, and for many, these tales were the only remaining source of hope. Yet hope alone could not protect the Republic. It required action, courage, and, above all, extraordinary timing. As the situation grew increasingly desperate, small acts of heroism emerged among the Valerie people. Civilians risked their lives to guide ships through dangerous areas. Soldiers volunteered for dangerous missions to defend key locations, and leaders worked tirelessly to maintain calm and order. These acts, though insufficient to stop the Crocs on their own, exemplified the resilience and determination of a civilization fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. The contrast between the human-like myth of intervention and the immediate, tangible efforts of the Valerie underscored both their vulnerability and their courage. In the final hours before what the Council feared might be total disaster, the outermost systems reported the largest and most coordinated attacks yet. Croc's warships bombarded cities, destroyed defenses, and moved in waves that seemed unstoppable. Evacuation ships struggled to escape, often coming under fire. Communications were fragmented, with pleas for help being sent continuously but receiving no answer. The Council understood that the Republic's survival now depended on forces beyond their own, on a rescue or intervention that could turn the tide in an instant. Every Valerie citizen, every soldier, and every council member felt the same tension. The critical moment had arrived. In this moment of extreme crisis, the Republic stood on the edge of destruction. They had done all they could with the resources available, yet it was clear that without extraordinary intervention, their civilization might not survive. The fear was overwhelming, yet the stories of humans, the legendary Deathworlders, persisted in the minds of the people. Their unpredictable, powerful, and determined nature represented the only chance for salvation. As the Croc's fleets closed in and the sound of alarms filled the cities and space, the Valerie waited, holding their breath, hoping that the fabled humans had finally received their call, and would arrive in time to save them from annihilation. This was the critical moment, the tipping point where despair and hope collided. The Valerie Republic, surrounded by enemies, outnumbered, and vulnerable, faced the ultimate test of survival. Every decision, every action, and every second mattered. The outer colonies were in flames. Evacuation ships were under attack, and the inner systems were threatened with destruction. Yet even in this chaos, the faint hope of the humans' arrival burned like a fragile flame, offering a slim but vital chance for survival. The Valerie had reached the point of no return, and the outcome now depended on forces beyond their understanding, on allies who could change the course of history in an instant. At the height of the crisis, when hope seemed almost gone and the Croc's fleets were poised to crush the Valerie Republic completely, the impossible happened. The void of space before the inner systems shimmered with the sudden appearance of warp signatures. Unlike anything the Valerie had ever seen, hundreds of ships, massive and powerful, dropped out of warp near the outer edges of the contested systems. At first, the Council and citizens could hardly believe what they were seeing. These were not small patrol vessels or diplomatic escorts. These were enormous warships, fully armed and coordinated, moving with precision and confidence. The sheer scale of their appearance was breathtaking. Every sensor on the Valerie homeworld lit up as these ships arranged themselves into formations that radiated strength, power, and inevitability. It was in this moment, amidst terror and despair, that the legend of the humans, the Deathworlders, became reality. The humans did not arrive quietly. Their fleet, vast and imposing, immediately made its presence felt. Croc's scouts detected them almost instantly, and within minutes, the Croc's Dominion realized that the situation had changed in a way they could never have anticipated. The humans were not a handful of reinforcements. They were a full-scale intervention force, prepared to take decisive action. Dread spread among the Croc's commanders who had grown confident from their previous victories. They had expected a weak civilization, perhaps a few token allies, but what they encountered instead was a fleet capable of obliterating their plans in moments. The humans' approach was methodical yet aggressive, showing no hesitation and no tolerance for delay. For the first time, the Crocs faced an enemy whose power and resolve matched, and perhaps even exceeded, their own. From the Valerie perspective, the arrival of the humans was overwhelming. Citizens crowded into observation decks, looking at the massive warships as they formed lines across the star. The human ships were unlike anything the Valerie had designed or imagined. They were enormous, durable, and equipped with weaponry so advanced that even the most experienced Valerie officers struggled to understand it fully. Yet beyond the technological marvels, what impressed the Valerie most was the confidence and decisiveness of the human fleet. There was no hesitation, no negotiation, only a clear, unmistakable intention to act. The humans were here, and they were ready to change the course of history. The Croc's Dominion, upon realizing the scale of the human presence, attempted to maintain their aggression. They had already committed their forces to the assault, and retreat was not an option they could accept. However, the humans did not allow hesitation. Within moments of entering the system, they launched coordinated attacks that stunned both the Valari and the Crocs. Dreadnoughts advanced toward the enemy lines, absorbing fire without faltering, while bombers and strike ships targeted key Crocs warships with surgical precision. Human boarding teams, known across the galaxy for their lethality, prepared to overtake enemy vessels that were once considered invincible. The Crocs, who had terrorized the region for decades, suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by a force they could neither predict nor match. In the Valari capital, council members watched in disbelief. Their careful plans, their constant worries, and their countless emergency preparations suddenly seemed small in comparison to what was unfolding before their eyes. Citizens, who had been gripped by fear and despair for weeks, now felt a surge of hope and awe. Families clung to one another as they watched the humans engage the Crocs fleet with unmatched precision and speed. Entire generations of Valari, who had grown up hearing legends of human resilience, were now witnessing those legends brought to life. It was a moment that would be remembered for centuries, a turning point that demonstrated the sheer power of decisive, courageous action. The battle that followed was swift and overwhelming. The humans coordinated attacks across multiple vectors, striking at the most critical Crocs ships first. Their tactics were unconventional yet highly effective, exploiting weaknesses that the Crocs themselves had not anticipated. Dreadnoughts drew enemy fire while lighter strikecraft disabled command ships. Bombers targeted supply lines and reinforcement vessels, effectively isolating the frontline forces. Human boarding teams moved with lightning speed, taking over enemy ships and turning them against their own allies. The Crocs' dominion, confident in their previous victories and their numerical superiority, found themselves unable to respond effectively. Every maneuver was anticipated, every strike countered, and every hope of victory systematically dismantled. Throughout the battle, the Valari observed how humans fought with a combination of strategy, instinct, and sheer determination. They were not merely relying on superior technology. They relied on understanding, adaptability, and relentless aggression, tempered with precision. Every action was calculated, every decision executed flawlessly under pressure. It was as though they had been designed for moments like this, for situations where survival was impossible without immediate and decisive action. The Valari realized that their myths about human stories of resilience, toughness, and relentless courage were not exaggerations. These beings were living proof of what their legends claimed. For the Crocs, the arrival of the humans was catastrophic. Their fleets, which had been a source of fear across the sector, crumbled under the sudden and overwhelming force. Ships that had been considered invincible were destroyed or captured within hours. Commanders who had once faced countless opponents without challenge now found themselves outmatched and outmaneuvered at every turn. Panic spread through their ranks as human strategies unfolded faster than they could react. It became clear that the invasion of the Valari Republic, which had seemed inevitable, was now in jeopardy. The balance of power had shifted completely, and the Crocs' dominion was forced into a defensive posture for the first time in years. Meanwhile, the Valari themselves began to participate in the battle in small but meaningful ways. Their remaining patrol ships, though weaker, were now supported by the humans' overwhelming presence. Coordinating with human fleet commands, the Valari were able to target remaining Crocs forces effectively. Civilians assisted in evacuation and logistics, ensuring that critical resources reached those in need. The Republic, which had been on the verge of destruction, suddenly became part of a coordinated effort to defend their homeworld and preserve their civilization. The morale boost was immeasurable. For the first time in weeks, fear began to be replaced by confidence, hope, and a renewed sense of agency as the battle progressed. The effectiveness of the human fleet became even more apparent. Dreadnoughts drew sustained fire without damage that could slow them. Bombers struck with pinpoint accuracy, and boarding teams overwhelmed the Crocs' defenses from within. The Crocs, despite their experience and ruthlessness, could not cope with this combination of strategy, skill, and technology. Their fleets were systematically dismantled, one ship at a time, until only scattered remnants remained. The Republic's citizens watched as their enemies, who had seemed invincible, were destroyed with astonishing speed and efficiency. It was a moment of revelation, a moment that forever changed the Valari understanding of power, courage, and resilience. Finally, after what seemed like hours but might have been only minutes in human terms, the Crocs' dominion was forced to retreat. Their remaining forces, broken and demoralized, fled the sector in disorder. The humans had achieved what the Valari had feared impossible. They had not only stopped the invasion but had effectively destroyed the enemy's ability to continue the campaign in this region. The Valari homeworld, and their remaining colonies, were saved. The citizens, once terrified and demoralized, erupted in relief, joy, and amazement. Their civilization had survived against overwhelming odds, thanks to forces beyond their comprehension. The humans, who had answered their desperate plea, had turned a moment of near-total despair into one of miraculous salvation. In the aftermath of the battle, the Valari began to understand the scale of what had occurred. The humans had arrived not as diplomats or minor allies, but as a fully mobilized and decisive force, capable of confronting and defeating the Croc's dominion in a matter of hours. Their actions had saved entire planets, preserved countless lives, and prevented the collapse of the Valari Republic. Beyond their military effectiveness, the humans had demonstrated something else: loyalty, courage, and a willingness to act decisively in defense of those in need. The Valari, who had relied on careful planning and diplomacy for centuries, were now witnessing a model of intervention that was as awe-inspiring as it was effective. The Council, who had spent weeks fearing for the survival of their civilization, met in the immediate aftermath to assess the situation. Their discussions, once filled with despair and indecision, now focused on recovery, rebuilding, and understanding the humans who had changed the course of their history. They realized that their myths about the Deathworlders were true. These beings were capable of incredible feats, and their intervention had come at precisely the moment it was needed most. For the first time, the Council could consider a future beyond survival, a future where the Valari Republic could rebuild stronger, protected by allies of unmatched power and loyalty. In the cities and among the citizens, celebrations were tempered by reflection. The loss of outer colonies and lives weighed heavily on everyone, but the overwhelming relief of survival dominated their emotions. Families reunited, emergency shelters were emptied, and the streets were filled with people marveling at the human fleet. Children who had feared the end of their world now looked up in awe at the ships that had saved them. Scholars began to study human tactics, leadership, and resilience, trying to understand how such a small species from a distant, dangerous world could accomplish so much in so little time. The event would be remembered for generations as a turning point, a moment when despair was transformed into triumph by extraordinary courage and power. As the human fleet prepared to depart, having fulfilled their mission, the Valari understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. Their civilization had been saved not by diplomacy or careful planning alone, but by the decisive and overwhelming intervention of allies who acted with precision, courage, and determination. The Croc's dominion, once feared as unstoppable, had been humbled and forced to retreat. The Valari Republic, though scarred by the conflict, survived and was given a chance to rebuild, strengthened by the knowledge that they were not alone in the galaxy. The humans, who had entered the system as unknown legends, left as saviors and allies, forever changing the Valari understanding of courage, power, and loyalty. The events of this phase marked the climax of the crisis, where all the fear, tension, and desperation reached a breaking point and were resolved through the extraordinary actions of the Deathworlders. It was a moment that redefined the Valari Republic, proving that even in the darkest hour, intervention, courage, and decisive action could turn the tide of fate. The Valari Republic had survived. The Croc's dominion, which had seemed unstoppable, had been forced to retreat, broken and humbled by the intervention of the humans. The initial shock of survival slowly gave way to a mixture of relief, awe, and contemplation. Citizens emerged from shelters and observation decks to see the human fleet departing, their enormous ships moving back into the stars with the same precision and confidence they had arrived with. It was an awe-inspiring sight, one that would be remembered in stories, paintings, and songs for generations. Yet the relief of survival was tempered by the knowledge that the Republic had been on the brink of annihilation, and that the price of near destruction had been heavy. In the weeks following the battle, the Valari began the difficult work of assessing the damage. Outer colonies had been devastated. Cities once thriving with culture, trade, and art were reduced to rubble. Industrial facilities, laboratories, and cultural centers lay in ruins. Transportation and communication networks were destroyed or severely compromised. Families had been separated, with countless lives lost during the Croc's assault. The scale of the destruction was staggering, and yet, amid this devastation, the Valari were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. They had survived, and survival offered the opportunity to rebuild, to learn, and to grow stronger. The Council convened immediately to coordinate recovery efforts. Every available ship, vehicle, and crew was dispatched to deliver aid, rebuild critical infrastructure, and evacuate remaining civilians from dangerous areas. The Council faced difficult decisions about priorities: which colonies would be rebuilt first, which populations needed to be relocated permanently, and which resources could be spared for reconstruction versus defense. The humans had provided protection, but the Valari still needed to manage the aftermath of a war that had devastated much of their territory. The logistical challenges were immense, but the sense of hope and renewed confidence allowed leaders and citizens alike to face them with determination. At the same time, the Valari could not help but reflect on what they had witnessed. The humans had arrived not as negotiators or minor allies, but as a decisive, overwhelming force. They had acted with precision, courage, and a willingness to confront impossible odds without hesitation. The Valari scholars and strategists began to study human tactics, technology, and approach to problem-solving with intense curiosity. They had seen firsthand how humans combined instinct, creativity, and determination in ways that allowed them to confront far stronger opponents and prevail. For the Valari, this was not just a military lesson, it was a profound revelation about resilience, courage, and the nature of survival itself in the capital. Citizens gathered to discuss and process the events. Markets and streets, once tense and anxious, were now filled with conversations about what had occurred. Children asked endless questions about the humans. How were they so strong? How could they fight so effectively? Why had they come to help? Adults debated the implications for the Republic's future. The events had shattered old assumptions about the limits of what was possible in the galaxy. For generations, the Valari had believed that careful planning, diplomacy, and negotiation were the keys to survival. The intervention of the humans had revealed another path that courage, decisiveness, and the willingness to act boldly in the face of danger could achieve results that careful planning alone never could. The political and strategic implications were also significant. The Valari realized that their civilization was no longer isolated. The galaxy was a dangerous and complex place, filled with forces like the Croc's dominion that could threaten their very existence. Yet, they had also learned that alliances could change everything. The humans had shown that intervention could turn the tide of war, even against seemingly invincible enemies. For the Council, this meant rethinking their approach to diplomacy, security, and military preparedness. While they still valued peace and careful negotiation, they now recognized the importance of having capable allies and the potential need for decisive action in future conflicts. The citizens of the Republic began the slow process of healing as well. Families reunited wherever possible, communities organized to help rebuild destroyed neighborhoods, and volunteers joined efforts to deliver supplies to the hardest-hit areas. There was grief for lives lost and for cities destroyed, but there was also resilience, a quiet determination to restore what had been damaged and to preserve the culture and knowledge of the Valari people. The humans had saved them, but it was now up to the Valari to take what remained and rebuild their civilization stronger, wiser, and more prepared for the dangers of the galaxy. That the memory of the battle and the human intervention quickly became a defining moment in Valari history. Historians began documenting every detail: the scale of the Croc's assault, the vulnerability of the Republic, and the sheer power and decisiveness of the humans. Scholars debated the implications of relying on allies like the Deathworlders, exploring what it meant for Valari's strategy, culture, and identity. Stories of the human fleet's arrival and the courage they displayed were told and retold in classrooms, theaters, and homes. The lessons learned went beyond military strategy. They touched philosophy, sociology, and the Valari understanding of courage, leadership, and the value of action in critical moments. The Council also recognized the need to prepare for future threats. While the humans had provided a decisive intervention, the Valari could not rely solely on external forces forever. They began planning improvements to their fleets, fortifications, and evacuation protocols. They studied the Croc's dominion's tactics, integrating what they had learned from both the battle and the human strategy. The intervention had demonstrated that the Valari were capable of survival against overwhelming odds, but it also highlighted the need to develop self-sufficiency in defense, communication, and crisis management. The Council's discussions were rigorous, reflecting a newfound understanding of vulnerability, resilience, and the necessity of combining diplomacy with preparedness. Culturally, the impact of the human intervention was profound. Artists, writers, and performers began creating works inspired by the events: paintings of human dreadnoughts against the Croc's fleet, stories of heroic boarding teams, and songs that captured the emotions of fear, hope, and triumph. The humans, previously legends in the Valari imagination, became real symbols of courage and action. These cultural expressions were more than just art. They were a reflection of a society that had been tested, saved, and fundamentally changed by events beyond its control. The people found ways to express gratitude, awe, and inspiration, embedding the memory of the humans' actions into the fabric of Valari society. The Valari also began reflecting on their own role in their survival. While the humans had provided the decisive intervention, the Valari had not been passive. Their preparation, evacuation planning, and ability to maintain order under immense pressure had allowed the human fleet to operate effectively. Citizens who had helped with logistics, defended key positions, or ensured civilian safety had played a crucial part in the overall success. The Council emphasized that survival was a combination of their own efforts and the extraordinary intervention of allies. This reflection fostered a sense of agency, pride, and resilience among the people. They had been tested, and while the humans had turned the tide, the Valari had contributed meaningfully to their own survival. In time, formal relations between the Valari and the humans began to develop. Messages of gratitude were sent, and envoys were prepared to meet with human commanders and leaders. The humans, who had arrived unpredictably yet decisively, had left a lasting impression on the Valari. They were no longer mythical saviors. They were real beings, capable of extraordinary feats, and potentially valuable allies for the future. The Council recognized that these new relations could fundamentally alter the Valari approach to interstellar diplomacy, defense, and exploration. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, but now they had proof that even the most unlikely allies could make a decisive difference. The aftermath of the conflict, also left the Valerie with deep questions about morality, ethics, and the nature of survival. But humans had acted with decisiveness, sometimes in ways that the Valerie might have considered extreme or unconventional. Yet the results were undeniable. Lives were saved, colonies preserved, and the Republic spared from annihilation. The Council and scholars debated the lessons of the human approach, how to balance bold action with careful planning, how to respond effectively to unexpected threats, and how to act decisively when circumstances demand it. These debates shaped the intellectual and moral framework of the Republic, preparing it to face future crises with a broader understanding of courage, strategy, and ethics. Meanwhile, citizens across the Republic began rebuilding their lives. Markets reopened, schools resumed classes, and transport networks were repaired. The sense of daily normalcy returned slowly, but it carried a new depth of appreciation. People valued safety, stability, and community more than ever, aware of how easily they had been on the brink of extinction. Children who had lived through the crisis grew up with stories of the human intervention, learning lessons about courage, hope, and the importance of both preparation and adaptability. Entire generations were shaped by this moment, ensuring that the memory of survival and the extraordinary allies who made it possible would endure. Over time, the Valerie learned to integrate the lessons of the human intervention into their society. Military strategies were updated, evacuation protocols refined, and emergency planning became a priority. Diplomacy was still valued, but it was now complemented by an understanding that decisive action, resilience, and preparedness were equally vital. The Republic emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of defending itself and its citizens. The intervention of the humans had changed their history, but it had also empowered them to take control of their own future in ways they had never imagined. Ultimately, the aftermath of the battle was not just about survival. It was about reflection, learning, and transformation. The Valerie had faced annihilation, experienced fear and despair, and witnessed the intervention of a legendary species whose actions reshaped the course of history. They had survived, and in surviving, they had gained a deeper understanding of the galaxy, the nature of courage, and the value of allies who act decisively in critical moments. Their civilization had been tested to its limits, and though scarred by loss, it had emerged stronger, wiser, and prepared to face whatever the galaxy might throw at it next. The memory of the humans, the Deathworlders, remained indelible. They had arrived when all seemed lost, acted with unparalleled precision and courage, and left a lasting legacy in the Valerie imagination. In the aftermath, the Republic reflected on its vulnerabilities, its strengths, and the extraordinary intervention that had preserved their civilization. The lessons of this phase would echo through generations. Hope can endure even in the darkest times. Decisive action can change the course of history, and the courage to act in the face of impossible odds can define the destiny of an entire civilization.